Yeah, so today's program is going to be a little different than some of our other programs. Let's kind of think of this as a guided group discussion, right? So I'm going to have a couple themes that are going to come up on some slides. Alice and I are going to talk about some of those themes. And I want to hear from all of you. So I will be monitoring the chat throughout this entire program. But if you have questions, put those in the Q&A because they might get buried in the chat with all the wonderful conversation that I hope will be happening during today's program. I see that my colleague Kurt already put a link to the handout in the chat. That's great. We'll be doing that throughout the program as well. But yeah, so what we're going to do, we're just going to talk about where they lived, right? So our immigrant ancestors, when they immigrated to the United States, those who stayed in major US cities, or at least stayed there for a little while, what would that have looked like for them? So what do those neighborhoods look like? So we'll talk a little bit about that. First and foremost, your ancestors did not live in a bubble. Before we get into the conversation, I do want to bring this point up because I think it's really important for us to remember that when we're researching our ancestors' lives, we want to look at not just the names, the days, the locations, but look at the whole document. When you look at the census, look at who their neighbors are. Look at where might they be working, where might they be buying their groceries, going to church, that type of thing. Because doing that type of research, looking at kind of the whole community, can actually open some doors for you. Maybe give you some ideas on where to find more resources to just add a little bit to the family story. So I kind of just answered that question, but Allison, do you have anything to add to this? So how does studying an entire community add to your family story?
Well, our colleague Kurt, who's on here, has a saying that I think is incredibly applicable to this. It's doing the history illuminates the mystery.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
I think that is the best way to put it. When you understand a community, you can understand your family better because everybody is impacted.
For sure, for sure. I see a couple of people mentioning where their immigrant ancestors lived. One person said that their Polish ancestors immigrated to Detroit. It's great. So, and there was a significant Polish like community in Detroit. So it'll be a lot of fun to start researching, even just a building or a street. Yeah, doing the history eliminates mystery. Amen. Thank you, Kurt. Okay. So let's talk about factors, right? So when y'all are finding a place to live now, all right, and many of us in here are not present day immigrants. I'm not, Allison's not. Some of you might be, but when you're picking a place to live, where would you choose to live? What are some of the factors? So let's kind of unpack that a little bit. Language is definitely a big one. I see someone mentioning that their German ancestors came to Zanesville, Ohio in the late 1890s. It's great. I love when you guys share in the chat. I'm reading a question in the Q&A. Somebody was asking if there was a large Polish Ashkenazi Jewish enclave in Detroit in the late 19th and early 20th century. I'm not entirely sure. That is something that I would have to research a little bit. What do you think, Allison?
I'm Googling.
You're Googling. Yeah, Google's your friend. When you're starting to do some of this research, it always begins with a Google search if you just don't know off the top of your head. The reason why I bring up language is because now this picture, I want to point out, this is the corner of Orchard and Rivington Street in the Lower East Side. Now, I used to work in the Lower East Side at the Tenement Museum, and there was something that we used to tell people on tours, which was at one point, the Lower East Side was considered the largest Jewish city in the world because there were just that many Jewish people. And that was around the turn of the century. most of which were Ashkenazi Jews. You also had some people who were Sephardic as well, but it was mostly Eastern European Jews. But you could stand on a street like this and see a lot of signs written in Yiddish, some signs like these written in English. This is not a super clear version of this picture. I've seen a more detailed version of it where you can actually read what some of these signs say, and actually those are written in Yiddish as well. But one of the things that we used to remind people is that sometimes if an immigrant is getting off the boat in Ellis Island, so they go to Ellis Island, they take the ferry, get off the boat in Lower Manhattan. If they don't have anyone waiting for them, or say the person waiting for them didn't show, you might follow people who are speaking your language. So if you're Italian and you hear people speaking Italian, you follow them. If you are Jewish and you hear people speaking Yiddish, you follow them. And that's how in places like New York, especially in Lower Manhattan, you'll get these little pocket communities. So if you don't have anyone and you know no information, which the likelihood of you knowing nothing going in, especially by the late 19th century, is a little slim. If you can just hear people speaking your language, you're going to want to go be with them, right? Because sharing a common language definitely opens up some doors, and people will go door to door to these tenement buildings and ask the people in the buildings, hey, is your landlord around? Because some of the landlords lived in the buildings, and if they are, they would say, do you have an open apartment? And that's how people were finding, one of the ways people were finding apartments back then. I see a lot of activity in the chat and I love it. One person saying that their German ancestor came through New Orleans on their way to Missouri. A lot of German neighborhoods in Newark and Ohio, and definitely Manhattan. Irish family in Pittsburgh. That's great. Yeah, I love all of you sharing your stories like this. This is great. And the person who brings up their Italian family in New York City, I might show an Italian example in a moment. Great. Okay.
Okay, so with the Polish Ashkenazi Jew neighborhood, it looks like there were several neighborhoods. I just sent them specifically a page that I found that might have some more sources at the bottom, but there's an entire newspaper called the Jewish News, the Detroit Jewish News, and it talks about the different areas where Jewish people came from in Poland to Detroit. And apparently they were creating their own aid societies. So there's some really, really cool pieces of information that are still there in Detroit.
Yeah, looking into immigrant aid societies are really interesting. I put a couple links to some specific ones in the handout just so you can kind of get an idea of what types of societies existed. But the immigrant aid societies were a great resource for people. And I'm glad that you brought up newspapers, Allison, because an example of a newspaper, the Illinois Stout Zeitung. So you're going to have dozens of these immigrant American newspapers, right? So there are so many iterations of the Stout Zeitung in many places. There's one in Louisiana. There's certainly one in New York, one in Alabama even. So this is a German American newspaper. And they're a lot of fun to find. I did put a link in the handout to the U.S. City Directory, the U.S. Newspaper Directory that is on the Library of Congress's website. You can actually, when searching in that, which I can show y'all an example in a little bit, when you're searching for newspapers in a place, you can filter it to show you certain types of ethnic newspapers. So if you want to see African-American newspapers, you can filter it to that. If you want to see Irish newspapers, German newspapers, Italian newspapers, etc., you can filter that and see what existed even in the state that you're researching. And it's really interesting. Highly recommend it. So let's move on. Affordability is a big factor when you're trying to find a place to live. Am I right? I would say so.
Yes.
So you're going to want to find a place that, is affordable. Now, this picture, 7 beds found in a room in a tenement house department and ordered to be removed. This is an extreme situation. In a city like New York, the average apartment size was 325 square feet, 3 rooms, a kitchen in the middle, a parlor, and a bedroom. Average family size is 4 to 6 people. So you will have people sharing cots. You will have people sleeping on other pieces of furniture. You will have fold away cots as well. This is an extreme example. It's not necessarily the norm, but pictures like this, this would have been created by the New York City Tenement Housing Commission. A lot of their pictures are kind of propaganda-esque because they wanted a shock factor to convince the wealthy, middle class to care about the poor. It's great. It's great. And the reason why I make that point was because the next picture is supposed to be the same room. It is not the same room, friends. There's linoleum on this floor. Where did the piano come from? But again, this is supposed to be kind of a shock factor thing. Okay, so I see a lot of questions in the Q&A. So let's kind of go through some of these as we go. What immigrants living in Europe, as we know it today, how will they know where to go when they get to America? Letters home, for sure. So from family members, friends from the old country writing back, immigrant guidebooks. So those will exist as well. Any other suggestions that you can think of? Well, newspapers.
Yeah. Well, chain migration was very real. But honestly, propaganda as well. There were communities that were actually looking for industrious people from certain countries to come and either farm or work in industry or whatever else. And they would even put advertisements in newspapers. Sometimes people would go door to door and say, hey, you want a new life? Here's some information.
Yeah.
So propaganda is very real.
Yeah, there was a lot of going back to the late 1700s through the 19th century in Ireland, a lot of shipping agent ads where they're promoting like,
oh yeah,
come look at this glorious life in America. And that is fascinating. I know of a customer whose ancestor was from Italy, and they were recruited actually by a coal mining company with some other Italians to come and work in the coal mine. I think that they were actually strike breakers, which is interesting, that's a whole other level, but you had this like group of Italians in the Pittsburgh area, and they were recruited by this coal mining company. So it's a lot, there's a lot of different ways as to how people are figuring out where to go when they get here. But yeah, there are a lot of factors.
Well, and so once they're here, it's also a factor of where they go. So they could end up in New York City and then see or hear whatever else of land, cheap land, or some other community further away. And maybe they stay in New York for a little bit to save up some money and then take off. It really depends on their situation and what they're trying to do.
Right. So the person asking what year is the photo at Orchard and Rivington Street, that picture I showed a couple slides earlier, that I used to know exactly the year off the top of my head, but it's early 1900. So let's see, my Reardon, Irish from County Kerry, immigrated through Cork to Boston in 3 different waves. Sources suggested depends on the time period. Other than looking at ship manifest, it kind of depends on the time period, and we would need more context about the family. I'd recommend sending us an email, and I can give you some specific suggestions. But yeah, send us an email. Our email is genealogy@acpl.info, which I'll put in the chat. Cool. Okay. What would be a good way to get a translation to English from a German historical newspaper? So other than hiring someone, there is an app called Text Grabber. I actually have it. I was looking for my phone, making sure it's actually called Text Grabber. Yes, Text Grabber. I'll put it in the, it can do, it OCRs it, and then it will translate. It is not perfect. The OCR is not perfect. So you kind of have to go through and like fix it, so to speak. So you can do it that way. That's what I have done with different newspapers. You can't do too much text at the same time, because then it will be like, no, this is too much, like the OCR breaks. But yeah, look into that if you're not prepared to hire a researcher. But some of these German American newspapers were actually in both languages. I know of a newspaper specifically in Louisiana that was French, and you actually had articles in French and articles in English like next to each other, and it's the same article. So you'd have to dig through the paper a little bit.
So another thing, so first of all, the Text Grabber, I just checked, it is both Apple and Android. So just wanted to double check that. And then also make sure to also check the Facebook groups. There's tons of Facebook groups out there that are able to do translation. Make sure that you're checking that it is a translation group. There also are transcription groups from script to written.
Yeah.
You got to be careful, because I see German, so I wanted to make sure that you are looking for that distinction. But some are really good and very helpful. So make sure that you're looking for these different types of groups on Facebook. It is a crowdsourcing tool for you to use.
Cool. So next factor. Somebody mentioned in the chat a book by Tyler Ambinder called City of Dreams. Yes, I highly recommend that book. And Tyler Ambinder also wrote another book called 5 Points. It is the most accurate, like, historical account of the 5 points and the history of the 5 points. Highly recommend it for those who might be reading up on Lower Manhattan history. Common religion is definitely a big factor. I mentioned earlier how Lower Manhattan, I'm using that as an example because it's what I know the most about personally. But this is like kind of applicable to other cities as well, other major cities at least. But I mentioned earlier that Lower Manhattan was considered one of the largest Jewish cities of the world in the late 19th century, early 20th century. There is a joke that you can stand in front of a Jewish synagogue, throw a rock, and hit another one. Now, while today that is not entirely true of Lower East Side, it's a lot of gentrification, among other things. And a lot of the Jewish people started to move to Brooklyn and other places. So the neighborhood changed. But even still, I very, very, very briefly lived in that neighborhood. And on my block, there were 3 synagogues. So that says a lot about the community and where someone might go for worship if that's something that is important to them, because that will be a factor in why they'll choose to live in a certain place.
They want to be close enough that they can typically walk to a church that is their denomination.
Right.
I was actually just helping a gentleman right before this program do Lithuanian research, and he was looking at his Catholic family, Roman Catholic, going from a town in Lithuania, which, by the way, we found the records online, those church records in Lithuanian, great fun to read, and Russian. So learning lots of languages. And they went directly to Chicago to another Roman Catholic church in a community, a Lithuanian community. So you can follow people. It's fantastic.
it's a lot of fun.
Oh, the Quakers.
Uh,
Yeah, they have great records.
I love Quaker records. I get so excited when I'm helping someone and their ancestor was a Quaker. I don't have any Quaker ancestors. I wish I did because the records are so great.
I know. I wish I did too. My husband does, but I don't. It's sad.
My husband's Catholic, in all the most oppressive ways. He's Italian and Irish and Cuban. Like, he's so Catholic it hurts. It's great. Um, anyway, would the different churches be possibly in different languages or points of origin? I'm really glad that somebody asked that because yes. So I am from the New Orleans area, and here's a little bit of interesting church building history for New Orleans. So in the 1840s, 1850s, you have this large influx of Irish immigrants coming in during the famine. And when they're arriving in New Orleans, they are Catholic, and New Orleans is a very Catholic city. So they start going to mass and they realize all the homilies, so the sermons, were being done in either French or Spanish. They're like, this is not our thing. So they begged the Archbishop of New Orleans to get them an Irish Catholic priest, to ship in a priest from Ireland just for them. And he said, sure, I'll do it, but you have to build the churches. And they also really wanted the parochial schools. And they really wanted the orphanages because the orphanage system in Ireland was a big part of their culture. And during yellow fever epidemics, people would put their children into the orphanage during yellow fever season, and whatever family members survived yellow fever season that year would reclaim the children. It's actually really fascinating. So there was mass church building happening in New Orleans in the 1840s and 50s by these Irish Catholics because they wanted their own priests. So if it's not there for them when they get there, they will build it, assuming there's a archbishop or some entity like him willing to accommodate.
Yeah, and that's actually true in Fort Wayne too. Some of the churches do have an affiliation to a specific ethnicity. So you'd have a German church, you'd have an Irish church, you'd have a French church.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Now, I wanted to put this church as an example because this church doesn't exist anymore. This is Third Presbyterian in Fort Wayne. It's actually in my neighborhood. It burned down in 1975. There are not very many pictures that we have of it from our community album. A lot of the pictures we have of it are when it burned down. So I just like to show this picture. My neighbor who owns the house that's on this property said that every summer when it gets really hot, there must be limestone underneath here because the outline of the old church burns out in the grass. It's kind of creepy. That's a side tangent. Work is definitely a big factor. What your commute looks like. Are there places to work? That is kind of a good indicator as far as like why you might choose a place to live. So all those other factors. Jennifer, I see that you have a question about hints, tips, tricks, etc. We're getting there, I promise. I promise we're getting there. Basically, I would say look at the census. That's like step one. And then look at maps. But I'll show you some examples, I promise. So yeah, like I said, finding a place to work is definitely a big factor as to why you might choose a certain neighborhood. Allison, do you have anything to add to that?
I think you covered most of it, and I'm also answering a question in the Q&A. But you know what? I'm actually going to say this one out loud.
Yeah.
So someone's looking for immigration records, and they came through Canada. I have really bad news. Canada didn't keep the passenger lists. They don't have a collection of passenger lists. So that's the bad news. There might B, depending on the time period, um, information on the move from Canada into the United States, but that also depends on the time period. So you might want to send us an email. We might be able to help with that. But one of the things that I always tell people if they see Canada is to look in the home country, see if there's any records of them leaving. Some places, some locations kept records of people leaving the country, not just the United States capturing information on when people are coming in. It's not true of everywhere, but give it a shot. See what you can find.
Cool. Okay, so food culture. I love this advertisement for lager beer. It's great. So we got a national drink, a family drink. Baby has a beer stein. Well, the mother's holding the beer stein, but it looks like the baby's drinking the beer. A healthy drink and a friendly drink. So food culture is definitely a big factor. In my opinion, it's a big factor as to why you might choose a place to live. So like, for example, if you're someone who keeps kosher, you're going to not want to live in a place that is nowhere near a kosher deli, right? As someone who is from Louisiana, I miss the food. I miss the food so much. But that's why God made the internet, so I can mail certain things to myself that I wouldn't necessarily be able to find here. So food culture is definitely like a really, really important part of your ancestors' life in general. And you can look at things like the Sanborn fire insurance maps. Sometimes you can pick out how many stores are in a geographic area, which is kind of interesting. You can definitely, sometimes they'll say if it's a butcher shop, it's just kind of adding a little more to the story because these are places that they could potentially be going. If you look at the city directory too, you can figure out what are some of the closest places they're going to be shopping, right? Because you're going to want to shop close to home. And that's true now. I mean, I'm not going to go to a grocery store on the other side of town unless it has something very specific I want, but like the likelihood is pretty slim. Pretty slim. Do you have anything to add to that, Allison? I know you love talking about food.
Food and beer. I have an entire presentation on beer. I think it's hilarious. But no,
Hilarious?
it's hilarious because you don't think about beer as being part of genealogy, but it is. It's occupational history. It's community history. It's food culture. It's all of that local history that you need to study to understand more of the story of your ancestors. And it's really interesting that you can directly link different brewers and the type of beer that they brought to the new country back to their home country. So they would be brewing a specific type of beer and bring it straight over to the new country. So it's kind of interesting to see how that works and the different foods that people bring as well. So the different stores, just like you said, Elizabeth, the different stores, the different butchers, bakeries, whatever, they're going to bring over what they know and love. And I just think that's amazing. And being able to look at that, being able to look at the advertisements, the newspapers, and be able to gather up that history is just beyond amazing. So yeah, I get really excited about this. I'm also really into collecting recipes as well. So this is my jam.
Yeah, someone actually like said in the chat, this is why you need to keep recipes of your ancestors if you have them.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, even if you don't have your ancestors, start looking for cookbooks that relate back to your ancestors. So
Yeah.
the community or even the ethnicity. So you can learn about the recipes that your ancestors may have used and the different types of animals they used and the parts.
Yeah. Yeah. I even just like sometimes food will affect history. So looking at like Depression era recipes is also really fascinating. But one thing that when I think of like food culture directly affecting history, or a historical event, there was something called the Kosher Meat Riot of 1902. This is when you had, it's kind of a complicated story. There's a book about it, which I have on my desk. It's just really far away. I can't reach it. It's called The Great Kosher Meat War of 1902. I can put that in the chat in a moment. But basically, the wholesale butchers, so the wholesale meat packers, they raised the price of kosher meat, only kosher meat. So the kosher butchers, who are family-run businesses, they had to raise their prices because they couldn't keep them what they were. And the women of Lower Manhattan lost it, because these are people they're seeing every day. I mean, your butcher is practically your family. In some cases, they might even be your family. And there was rioting. There were bricks thrown through windows. For a temporary period of time, the Jewish women of Lower East Side were vegetarian. They would, because they went on a strike. And also the women, there was a whole thing where they went to go sit in the men's section of one of the major synagogues down there, which is like, no, you don't do that. It's a big no-no. And at one point, so the women would go into these tenement buildings, because, the front door of these buildings were unlocked. They would walk up and down the halls, and if they could smell someone cooking meat, they would come into your apartment and throw your food out the window because you're breaking the strike. It was a big deal. And I mean, imagine having an ancestor living in that area at that time. They might have been affected by that in some way. Your ancestor might have temporarily been a vegetarian. So things like that they just add a little color to the story that you might not necessarily find in just like your typical records. So this is what we're going to do now.
I'm just in there chatting with people in the chat now.
I love when all of you just start sharing things in the chat. It's great. So this is my last slide before we get into like, okay, how do we actually like research a community, research a neighborhood? But the last factor of like why someone would choose to live in a certain neighborhood is they want to be around their people, right? Some of these people will have a shared culture, shared memory. That is not the rule exactly. A good example of the opposite of what I just said was my great-grandfather. When he immigrated in 1916, he did not want to be around other Irish people aside from his wife, because he had a very traumatic childhood in Ireland. He didn't want to live in the Irish neighborhood in New Orleans. He got married in one of the non-Irish like Catholic churches. He wanted nothing to do with Ireland. And my dad actually said to me recently that when he would ask his grandfather ask his father actually, so my grandfather would have been the first generation. Where did our people come from? And my grandfather would say, why do you want to know about that? It's not important. Why do you want to know? So there was a lot of trauma there. So it's not the rule, but it's something to think about when you do have your ancestor living with a big group of people who are all from the same place. Yeah. So I hear y'all are talking about haggis in the chat. That's great.
Yeah, it's been going on. It's been interesting.
Haggis. Interesting. Okay. So how/where do we get started? Census is the first place I would start. Jennifer, this slide is for you. I know you've been waiting for it. So who were your ancestors' neighbors? All right, what language did they speak? Where were they from? Look at the adults compared to the children. You might have like all the children are from the United States, or maybe the younger ones where the adults are from other countries. See who's living around them. Fire insurance maps, like the map that's in the background of this slide. That's kind of a good indication of what other things are around them, whether that is places to work, places to worship. Sometimes you might see food to eat. So that's something I like to do. I'm a very visual person. I like to look at maps. Library of Congress, their digital collection is your friend for the fire insurance maps. City directories. Somebody asked what a fire insurance map was. So I'm going to explain. So Sanborn was a company that created these fire insurance maps where insurance companies would use the maps to determine how much they're going to charge a building owner in their premium. So a fire insurance map, on it, you'll see yellow, like if a building is yellow in color, it means it's a wood frame construction house. If it's red or pink, that means it's a brick construction house. So you'll say what something is made out of. It'll say if it's a dwelling or a store. It'll say how many stories it is. It'll say it has all kinds of stuff. We will actually have a program in October, Family History Month, about how to use maps for genealogy. And the person giving that program is from the New York Public Library. I don't remember the date of that program off the top of my head, but stay tuned for that. That will be on a Tuesday if you're interested in just like how to use those maps, because I know Philip Sutton will talk about fire insurance maps in more detail. But if there's if it's a school, it will say school. It's you can get so much information out of fire insurance maps. They're a great time. I love that other people are saying that they're map freaks. Yes, yes, it's great. So yeah, city directories, another good thing to use to see, you know, what businesses might have been around. Look around that address. Depending on the year, it might have an address lookup in the back, so you can even see which street, like look by the street, which is a lot of fun. Yeah, what were the local businesses? I did talk a little bit about ethnic community newspapers in the area. So the Library of Congress newspaper directory is great for this. I'll show you an example of it in a moment. And just read up on the local history. Read up on the history of, you know, a town. Start with the town, right? Start with the city, and then just see if you can find books or articles written about immigrant communities kind of in general, and look at the footnotes of that writing. The footnotes can give you a lot of clues to go look for things, look for more. And most importantly, contact those local entities, contact the local historical and genealogical societies, contact the nearest public library, because they're there to help you. And they will know more about what was going on in the community at different time periods. So definitely reach out to those local sources. So I'm just reading the chat. It's just
I went ahead and put a link to the Sanborn maps on the Library of Congress website. It's very not easy. It's not an easy.
It's not easy to use. I'm not gonna lie. Yeah, but you gotta dig. You gotta dig.
But you can get it. You can get the maps, and it is so much fun.
Right. So we have a little bit of time. So y'all keep putting questions in the Q&A so they don't get buried. I'm going to show you an example of how you can use some of these sources mentioned in this slide to piece things together. So the example I want to show you guys is my husband's great-grandfather, Salvatore Calcaterra. So he was from Italy. So start with either the federal or the state census. So this is the 1915 New York State Census. So let's take a look at the page. Now, where he was living at the time, which I'll show you on a map in a moment, was East 101st Street, 107th Street, I'm sorry. That is not Little Italy, but look at all the Italians. So we have Salvatore right here, his wife, 2 sons. We have some other people living next door, but look at all these Italians. So many. I like to look at, you know, what are people doing for a living? What are his neighbors doing? Because that can kind of give you an indication of also socioeconomic background of the community too. So let's see. So Salvatore It says on here that he was an electrician. He actually, on other records, he's called a machinist. He worked for the New York City Railroad Company. He has some other people who are dressmakers, so they're working in garment factories, building labor, button factory, cigar factory, so a lot of factory workers, right? Now, I wanted to see, so this is the building number. So he lived at 328 East 107th Street. So I wanted to see, where is he living, right? What did the neighborhood look like? So I went to the New York Public Library's digital collection, and I found in this atlas, this is the Allison City, New York, I found the building, and then I looked at the whole page to see where people are living. Let's see. Why are we not behaving?
Because we're live.
Of course. Well, we're not wanting to zoom in more, but I can kind of explain some things that I saw in here. So his apartment would have been right here. Now we have a garage, we have an ice factory, we have a lot of factories going on over here. This would be right next to the East River, which on this they call the Harlem River. This would have been from around the same time frame that he would have been living in that building. Down here, there's a Catholic school. So that is a good reflection on the community. So there's a Catholic school. There would have been a Catholic church, I think, on the other side of the street that's just not on this plate. There are several public schools. There's a public bathhouse close by, which I think is over here. So many people are not going to necessarily have plumbing or a shower necessarily, I should say. You're going to probably have a sink, and a lot of people had these stone tubs in their kitchens. An adult couldn't really fit in it, but it's good for washing your clothes, and kids can bathe in there. But a lot of people are going to public bathhouses, so that's within walking distance. And one thing I found kind of interesting is that he's not too far from the elevated train. Now, as somebody who lived in New York for several years, the first thing I did when I realized, oh, he lives by the train, was I wanted to map his commute to see what that looked like. So I found an elevated train map. Now, it's not going to let me zoom in, but he would have been working. I found the address exactly of where he was working. It was on West 50th Street, which is right here. I know this is super small. Sorry, guys. I thought this would let me zoom in more. So there's a train stop here. He would have, but this wouldn't have been his stop. He would have had to have gone all the way down and then just walked it a couple blocks, which is not that far in the grand scheme of things, but he certainly wouldn't have been walking all of this way. I mean, you could do it, but that's a big waste of time. That's a big waste of time. Do most religions have some sort of repository for church records, especially those that are no longer functional? It depends. It depends on the denomination, depends on the area. If you're looking for something specific, send us an email and we might be able to give you some ideas on where you can possibly find those records. I love all the love for the transit maps in the chat. So much
I just put in a book called the Harvard Encyclopedia of American Ethnic Groups. Somebody had mentioned that there's a series that has Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and that's true. But not every state really has that. So the best option would be the Harvard Encyclopedia of American Ethnic Groups. Take a look at that. If you have anybody coming into Ohio, Indiana, or Illinois, peopling Indiana is another great option. It explains why immigrants from different immigrant groups came to the area. The reason I'm expanding that is because some of the people that settled in Indiana were in Ohio first, or then they moved on to Illinois. So that would be a really good spot to look at as well. Or if you knew your family stopped in Indiana at some point, people in Indiana, love it.
Yeah. Someone said in the chat that they found the address of the clothing manufacturer that their grandmother worked at. It was located on the land where Sears, now Willis Tower sits today. And she realized that a shoe store that her grandmother used to talk about would have been on the route from the commuter train station to work. That's really neat. That's great.
I just put it in the chat.
Great. I love how this entire program, y'all have been like sharing resources. I've been keeping an eye on that. And that's why I love doing these programs, because, you know, I love a good mind hive. Yeah.
And also I will also say that the People in Indiana book is such a favorite of mine that I own a copy, and it's actually behind me over here. I'm not going to turn around and go grab it.
Great. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I don't see any other questions in here, namely because you've all been having such great conversation and I love it. Thanks everybody for tuning in for this like kind of unusual program. We like to change things up on you sometimes.
This had a little bit more audience participation, which is fun.
Yes, I like hearing from all of you. It's great.
Well, and it's really interesting to be able to have you guys crowdsource with one another in the chat. And we see that. We see that every time we do a program. And we see these great conversations you're having. Like, we want to be a part of this.
Yeah.
So we were a part of it a little bit today. It was fun.
Awesome. Are plat books useful? Yes. Plat maps are useful for those who might not know what a plat map is. It's basically, to give a very generic summary, like summary definition, it's a map that shows where property lines approximately are and who owned those. You'll have a first initial last name or even just a last name. Very helpful if you're looking at like a rural community. See how many farms are out there and who owns what land.
Yes. Tried to pick a picture. You can kind of find them online. A lot of them are digitized because they're older.
Right.
So those are fun to find.
I love a good map.
I do too. And it's fun to look at if you are looking at a different plat map and it's maybe, I don't know, in the 1800s sometime, then pull up a Google map and try to compare the land, you can still sometimes see the outline of the original land that was in your family. There'll be like a weird like tree break or something else going on. If you are looking at it from like the camera view on top, you can sometimes actually see where the land was. Now, if it became part of a city, not so much.
Just answering a question in the Q&A. Is it better to look at the original or a digitized copy? I think it's better to look at the one you can get your hands on. So if the original is located somewhere nowhere near you, look at if there's a digitized copy of it somewhere, look at that.
Oh yeah. Oh, I'm seeing lots of questions about the chat. Please email us genealogy@acpl.info for a copy of the chat. That is so organizational wide. It is disabled for saving. So we automatically save it and then we will send it out to you once you request it. You do have to email us and request a copy of the chat and then we will send it to you. So please feel free to do that. We would be delighted to do so. You guys are still putting in amazing resources and I'm loving this so much.
I know, it's great. Immigrant entrepreneurship. Business biographies. Oh, this is cool. Interesting. Very cool. Thanks for sharing this.
Was that through? Ooh, bottom. Go to the bottom of the page. Wow.
Very cool.
That's awesome. Guys, I'm such a nerd. I always look to see who owns a website, who's making the shots, like who's calling the shots, who's deciding
Yeah.
this information is going online. So that's a really neat thing. The government's doing it.
And it looks good. It's because it's
Yeah.
Germany. It's because it's Germany. That's why.
So there's some amazing resources out there, and you guys keep putting them in there. So I'm hesitant to shut this down right at this moment.
You know what? You will have other opportunities in the future to share all of the resources. Family History Month is coming.
It is.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that, Allison?
We have some exciting things coming up. We've been working very hard to plan our programs for September and especially for October. October is Family History Month. So we always have extra things happening during the month. So it's going to be a month of not only classes like this, but there's also going to be interactive components. We're going to be trying to communicate with you in different ways. And honestly, if you guys have any suggestions, shoot us an email. If there's something that you're just like, you should try this format of communication, learning, etc. Let us know. We would love to open up that dialogue and have your ideas as well, because honestly, that's what we're here for. We're here to help you guys be successful, and we would absolutely love to know what would make you more successful as researchers and genealogists. So shoot us an email. Have all of the 1950 census info been transcribed and available online? Yes, not well. I mean, it's OCR. It's OCR handwritten material. So it is. You just have to double check it.
Yeah.
So you can search and they are coming up. It's not perfect. And honestly, I think it took years for 1940 to be anywhere near what it is today.
Yeah.
So not well is an understatement. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So you still may need to utilize the tools like stevemorris.org or utilize other tools that you can find on the census website. But there's lots of things you can do. Oops, we answered you. Let's see here. German ancestry. We have a German conference coming in
Yes,
June
please
of
talk about that.
2023. I don't know if you guys know this. The International German Genealogy Partnership has selected Fort Wayne as the location for their 2023 conference. This is an international genealogy conference. They are bringing in speakers from not only the United States, but other German-speaking countries. So we're talking about Germany and other locations. So please mark your calendars. It is in June of 2023. I can get you the exact dates. And you know what? In fact, let's bring up the website.
It will be at the same time as German Fest as well. So Germans will descend upon Fort Wayne in many ways.
We are going to have the most German time, and it's going to be delightful. I am looking forward to
the most German time.
I am so looking forward to it. Okay, let me share my screen. I had to get rid of a few things. No, I have a lot going on here. Okay, so iggp.org is the website. And then if you go to the 2023 conference, you can see where there's information. The conference is June 9th through the 11th. There's the hotel rates and you have some information. So
will there be beer at German Fest?
At
which
German
you
Fest?
Could theoretically walk to from here.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's walking distance.
Yeah.
So German Fest is walking distance. There's 100% beer there. The Fort Wayne Turners usually run the beer tent. Like they're the ones that are serving the beer there. So all the German organizations here in Fort Wayne get together, put on this amazing German fest, and then we're having this international genealogy conference at the same time where you can just be all German all the time. Because you can't tell I'm excited.
All right. We are just about out of time. I like beer. It makes me a jolly good fellow. Do you know anything about registration?
Registration hasn't opened yet. They're still working on the program and they want to have the program complete before putting the registration online, but I can tell you they are actively working on it. I will also tell you that the hotels are getting booked quickly. So if you have any desire to come, go ahead and book a hotel and you can always cancel it later. I hope you don't, but you can.
So we are just about out of time. Thank you, Allison, for joining me for this kind of odd but fun program format. I think we've all had a great time. The last question that a couple people have asked, and then we'll finish up, was will there be a virtual component to this, or is it all in person?
No, there's going to be a virtual component. I don't know what that looks like yet. That's up to IGGP, and they are working that out right now, but I do know that they are working out those details actively. So it will be virtual and in person. So it's going to be hybrid.
Very cool. All right. All right, friends, if you have more questions for us, or if you would like a copy of the chat, send us an email. I just put that in the chat, but it's genealogy@acpl.info. Hope all of you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.